So does anyone in the audience know what fraction of the prescriptions dispensed are generics currently? Any guess? 80%, right? So I think the latest number I've seen for 2012 was 84%. So of all, and so this is basically a metric of the patient exposure to, FDA-approved drug products. So, all of the work that we do on safety and efficacy studies, the things that actually eventually get exposed to the patients are all, 84% of them are formulations manufactured by some other company that gets approved through FDA's Office of Generic Drugs. That's what patients are actually getting exposed to. And so the really important, scientific question for FDA's Office of Generic Drugs is we have to ensure that those products are equivalent, right? They're going to provide the same safety and efficacy that people expect based on the clinical studies of the brand products. And that's the focus of our science activities. I think it's really important because, you have to ask, why has it gotten to 84%? It's not because it's sort of been tested in the free marketplace and 84% of the people chose, the generic products. It's really driven by the sort of, amazing efficiency of pharmacy, healthcare payers, pharmacy benefit manufacturers to rapidly and immediately switch people to the generic drug. And how do you look at that? FDA has, based on a lot of the recent, safety initiatives really over the last 10 years, expanded our Office of Safety and Epidemiology, how we look at, safety of approved products, especially for the new drugs. But it's a little bit trickier to say, how do you apply those same types of tools to generic drugs? Even a sort of simple example would be someone files an adverse event report. So it says, my drug didn't work. But if it's a product where there's generics, right, which formulation were they using? Which product were they using? They just say, well, I was using, this is the name of the drug. They may not even know, right? So the challenge for FDA is this something that's related to the active ingredient itself, a common issue for the branded generics, or is it potentially an issue with this particular generic product has a problem with its manufacturing? It's substandard, it's not delivering the right dose. And it's very difficult challenge to get the right kind of data, but also to analyze it and sort through. You have a lot of confounding effects. When generics come on the market, you always see a spike in adverse event reports, even when there's a problem and when there's not a problem. So you can't just say, well, look, the generics came on the market, there's more complaints, right? We know that happens even when authorized generics come on the market. These are products that are absolutely the same as the brand product, just marketed differently. They also show complaints. People complain that they've been switched to a product that doesn't even require an application, just is rebranded. So there's lots of difficulties in sorting through that type of post-market data. But it really is an important question for the Office of Generic Drugs and the whole generic drug program. How do we assess how well we're doing at approving safe and effective drugs? Can we monitor that correctly? And we have a range of activities in there to sort of work around this. Sometimes we do prospective studies where we'll actually take some of the approved generic products and compare them in controlled studies in patients where people are switched from the brand back to the generic product and measure not really clinical efficacy endpoints, but bioavailability, bioequivalence on the marketed products under clinical use and patient conditions. That's one part of that role, to provide different sets of data to evaluate sort of how we're doing in terms of the products we're approving and assessing them and feeding that back into our regulatory science activities. The next two topics face a different part of the question about opening the pathway for generic drugs for all different product categories. So here, so for simple tablets, capsules, oral solutions, right, the requirements for generic drugs are very clear. Well-defined bioequivalence study. The manufacturing of these dosage forms are standardized, very clear. Not much issues with access to generic products for those dosage forms. As soon as the patents are clear or exclusivities are clear, we know we're going to get lots of applications for those. But there are other categories where it's not so clear. The biggest one of these are inhalation products for asthma, right? Currently, that whole product category, it's a huge product category, especially in terms of spending, because in that whole product category, there currently are no approved generic products. And the question is sort of, why is that? And it has to do with both the complexity of the product, and that's the second category, and the third category, the locally acting nature, right? These products act directly in the lungs, right? So our usual way of demonstrating bioequivalence, comparing plasma levels, are the AUC and Cmax the same, isn't really telling you that the drug's being delivered to the lung the same, because it shows up in plasma later. The next category is sort of the therapeutic equivalence evaluation standards for these non-complicated dosage forms. And an example of this would be, for many years there's been some concern in the epilepsy community that generic anti-epileptic drugs don't work as well as the brand product. So these are mostly standard, immediate release tablets and capsules, some modified release tablets and capsules. So they're not really, complicated products with complicated dosage forms. But yet, in the use of these products, there's concern about, maybe these products have such a narrow therapeutic index that you need to have much tighter control of the bioavailability, the quality standards than we usually do. Or, perhaps it's driven more by bias in reporting, right? You see a problem with a generic product, you might be more likely to report it, even though there's some background rate of product failure that's common to just the drug itself. So we're working on ways across the whole range of products to identify those categories that maybe have near a therapeutic index, or that have other ways of the products being used that need sort of standards for equivalence. Like an example might be, a product might be labeled to be given through a feeding tube. So that means you have to have some idea of the generic version. If you crush it and suspend it, it won't clog the tube. It won't clog the tube when it's used in that method. So there's other aspects of patient use that come into those standards. Another even simpler one might be, generic product doesn't have to have the same tablet size as the brand product. How much bigger can it be before it becomes a problem, right? That's an example of a regulatory science question, right? At some point, you can make a tablet too big to where it's going to be an issue for some people, right? But it's very difficult to sort of identify where that point is. How big, does a generic product always have to be smaller than the brand product? That's very restrictive, right? Limits your formulation ability, limits the ability to sort of manufacture in a different way. But if it's too large, it really can be a problem. And so that's an example of where our sort of equivalent standards, need to be informed by some regulatory science methods to try to figure out, is there some way we can do this more rationally than just saying, well, this one looks too big. And then finally, the regulatory science also supports a lot of modeling activities as well as characterization tools that really can be applied to all these different areas. So that's, I think, a broad overview of what we're doing. So in my slides, I'll go in the slides, since we're running a little bit short on time. I'll have the slides basically have for each of those regulatory science topics some examples of things we've done, things we're doing this year, mainly through grants and contracts that'll be awarded, in this fiscal year, in the next few weeks, to support the research activities in that way. But I do, as sort of just an overview of of why I think this is important and why it's an important collaborative effort between both FDA and the generic industry, right? They're providing the sort of funding for this type of activities. So the main reason, why do we do regulatory science? And both for FDA and for industry. And the reason for doing that is regulatory science ought to lead to better decision-making processes, right? And in FDA, I gave the examples, right? Give better advice to sponsors before they do the work, right? And this comes through, guidances that we put out. In the generic drugs, we have a strange thing called controlled correspondence. And what this means is this is when, since, if we get 1,000 applications a year, we can't meet with companies before they submit their applications, right? In new drugs, right, companies can always meet with FDA. I mean, maybe companies don't always take advantage of that the way they should, but they can always get meetings before they submit their applications. We just can't routinely do that for 1,000 applications. So we have what we call controlled correspondence, where companies, send in written questions. And, that's a way that, short of guidance and the clearances that provides, is sort of an alternative to meetings to provide information to sponsors. And also within our review process, right, when there's complicated scientific questions in the review about equivalence, right, the regulatory science activities can really have a basis for saying, this is why we're going to decide in a certain way. And then post-approval, there's questions about generic substitution that are very important. For industry, right, regulatory science is also important, like leads to their decisions about formulation development, what size tablets am I going to make, right? They have that under their control. Like, if they know they have to make a tablet that's closer in size, right, that's a constraint that they give to their formulation scientists and say, don't come to me with a 1.2 gram tablet for this product, right? That's something at the beginning of their development process they can integrate in, right? And as well as passing your bioequivalence studies the first time, right? If you have better tools, for example, if you have a dissolution method that can predict bioavailability, right, you can evaluate your formulations in vitro very quickly, pick the formulation that's going to be closest to the reference product, and you're going to pass your bioequivalence study the first time, right? You're going to have a faster development path with those regulatory science tools, as well as have regulatory confidence, right? If you're following good science and FDA is following good science, there's more sense that there'll be alignment on if there's areas where there's not written guidance, that there'll be uncertainty if we're both on the same scientific page. But again, the common need here is both of us need better decisions, and I think both FDA and industry, right? If an industry that's successful is customer focused, right? So if the generic industry is focused on the needs of their customers, those are the patients, right? And that ought to be FDA's focus as well. So we also have that common alignment with what we're working toward. So at least I hope that over these next 4 years of this user fee agreement and the regulatory science activities, that's sort of the unifying theme, and that we can, industry is providing the resources, they can also collaborate in other ways, provide input into our process as well. So I said most of my slides give sort of examples of work that we're doing in the topic. So you can look through those in your leisure. They have links to either guidances or papers that we've published, or grant announcements that have come out this year, so you can see the types of research that we've been funding. So just to give you an overview of like where do these resources go, this $20 million? A lot of it goes to grants and contracts to work with mainly universities on conducting studies across these different areas. It also supports postdoctoral fellows at FDA. So from the GDUFA resources, probably next year at FDA, we'll be hiring about 25 postdoctoral fellows, both to work in FDA's labs on these type of projects and to work in our offices in OGD on these projects. So, if there's graduate students that are finishing this year, please feel free to talk to, send me your CV, and, so we'll be looking for, a range of, postdoctoral fellows in all of these different areas, from formulation scientists to modeling and simulation scientists to, be involved in these research projects inside FDA, as well as in collaboration with our external people who are doing laboratory work or different types of activities. So this is, exciting.